Well, today I wanted to talk about, I've been doing a long series of failures of Christianity, and I've done 11 topics previously, and so today will be the 12th. If you'd like to look them up on our archives, you're welcome to do that. They're all there. Today I want to talk about nothing new under the sun, referring to Jesus, or nothing novel about Jesus. So many Christians claim that Jesus is miraculous and it makes him somehow special. Certainly that's a good thing to have if you're going to have a religion. There's a lot of usual traits. There's a lot of uninteresting traits that are attributed to Jesus too, and I won't be talking about those, like the fact that he was a man, supposedly, and a carpenter, and a firstborn, and had brothers and sisters, and was a rabbi. And even the crucifixion is not that unusual because a lot of people were crucified. But there were all sorts of unusual claims about Jesus, supernatural claims, many of them. And all of those, or at least the main ones, have all been seen in earlier religions. So either the earlier gods and heroes existed and had these traits, and rendering Jesus just kind of run-of-the-mill and uninteresting in the long line of gods, or somehow the earlier stories are myths, but not Jesus. And God, in creating this Jesus story, lacked any sort of imagination. So maybe God doesn't have enough imagination to come up with anything new, like might have been seen in the Eastern religions or in the New World
wasn't
religions.
it Joseph Campbell who said there are only like 11 archetypes of all stories or something like that?
So that speaks to the fact that maybe it's human creation and human nature involved here, and not so much supernatural stuff. So either way you slice it, the failure of Jesus of doing anything truly novel is definitely a failure of Christianity. And I think it's most likely that Jesus is an amalgam of traits cobbled together, consciously or unconsciously. And there was this tradition of pious fraud in early Christianity of embellishing to get converts. And so that's what I think is going on here. I don't have concrete proof of it. I won't say that that's actually factually what happened, but boy, it sure does look that way. So I want to look at the supernatural claims of Jesus, and all of these are things that my examples will be of earlier religions, earlier gods, or gods that were known at the time of Jesus' alleged birth. So there's this virgin birth, there's being born under a star, him having great wisdom, miracles, ascension to heaven, resurrection, and the second coming. And I should mention that I'm touching on some themes that were brought up in the movie Zeitgeist.
Blah.
And
Zeitgeist.
Russell wrote a nice blog post on our Atheist Experience blog about it, and that movie is not very good in the sense that it really overreached and really didn't have very good scholarship, and there's a link on his post to a critique of that, and I recommend to read that. I'm going to try to avoid those little traps.
Yeah, I don't have a comprehensive response to Zeitgeist.
Right.
I put together something Matt wrote and then put links to other stuff I've written, and also like links to sites that go after various parts of the movie.
Right.
In addition to being terrible scholarship, it's also a really awful movie. So.
Right. Well, it has a strong conspiracy theory slant to it, and the religion part of it is the sort of the first third of it. Then it goes into 9/11 conspiracies, and then the Illuminati and all that stuff. So
right, and I mean, like a lot of conspiracy theory, it's got possibly specks and elements of truth in it, but it just works really over time at coming up with all these wild, outlandish connections that there's no real evidence of.
Right. So, and it's unfortunate because I think you can make a strong case that there's a problem here without resorting to those techniques. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm going to try to do today. So let's talk about the virgin birth. Well, in Egyptian mythology, the conception of Horus by Isis is traced all the way back to the beginning of Egyptian history, and Horus's conception and birth were understood in terms of parthenogenesis, or virgin birth. So there's an example of a virgin birth. God-human pairings were quite common in Greek mythology. Zeus was a very busy guy, and he produced all sorts of children, half-breed children of Hercules and Dionysus were among those. The Alexander, the Ptolemies, and the Caesars were all said by some scholars to have been virgin-born. So this is a way of elevating them in their stature and making them purer. And it was said that the god Zoroaster's birth was foretold from the beginning of time, at the moment he was born, he burst out laughing, and the whole universe rejoiced with him. So as you can see, this virgin birth or birth through magical means is a common theme in mythologies. In the Bible, the virgin birth, there's a very interesting history of how the Bible got to have this virgin birth thing. It's based on a story in Isaiah 7:14 that was written around 735 BCE. And the king at the time received a message from his prophet Isaiah during a war at that time, and it said, "Therefore the Lord of his own shall give you a sign. Behold, the woman is with child, and she shall bear a son, and the son's name, and he shall be called Emmanuel." So that's Isaiah 7:14.
Well, we got that wrong. They called him Jesus.
Well, yeah. Well, there's this conflation, right? And this particular phrase, this particular virgin birth story or birth story was rehashed. It's a midrash sort of thing in the New Testament. So this is generally taken by commentators to be the original context, a reference to the non-miraculous birth of Hezekiah, or another contemporary child, as indicated in Isaiah's following, an indication of timing. The Septuagint and other Christian translations following the application of Isaiah 7 to Matthew 1, they used the word virgin instead of young woman. So it got copied and pasted in another completely different context and embellished. And Justin Martyr may have been the guy who did this, an early Christian father.
Right. So to be clear, you're saying the New Testament definitely says he was born of a virgin, but they were doing that to try to retrofit it to an old prophecy in the Old Testament that didn't say virgin at all.
That's right. And wasn't prophecy at all.
Right.
So
yeah, like a lot of prophecy is just talking about current events, and then people come in later and they're cherry picking for prophecy, and they say,
right.
"Oh, look at that! They said that would happen, and sure enough, it did."
Right. So at best it's a cut, copy, paste error, and at worst it's a deliberate embellishment. How about born under the star? Well, in the Christian tradition, the Star of Bethlehem, also called the Christmas star, mentioned in Matthew 2, revealed the birth of Jesus to the biblical Magi, and who later led them to Bethlehem. It's not mentioned in the earlier Gospels, so that raises the question: was it not known, which doesn't seem likely, or was it not important, which doesn't seem likely? But when you kind of view the context of Matthew in context in the time it was written, Matthew's description of the miracles and portents attending the birth of Jesus can be compared to stories concerning the birth of Augustus, which is 63 BCE, linking his birth to the first appearance of a star, or linking a birth to the first appearance of a star was consistent in popular belief that a person's life was linked to a particular star. There's so many stars, right? You got to have some connection to them. The Magi and astronomical events were linked in the public mind to a visit to Rome by a delegation of Magi at the time of a spectacular appearance of Halley's Comet in 66 CE. So this is 66 years after the birth. There's this embellishment going on of the gospel based on what was kind of going on at the time that this was written, not at the time that was being written about. So this delegation was led by the king of Tiridates of Armenia, King Tiridates of Armenia, who came seeking confirmation of his title from Emperor Nero. The ancient historian Dio Cassius wrote, "The king did not return by the route he had followed in coming," a line echoed in Matthew's account. So this seems to be, a marketing embellishment. What about great wisdom? Well, this isn't a supernatural thing, but if you're supernatural and you're a god, maybe you know some things that other folks don't. Well, what about the Golden Rule? The Golden Rule dates way back, dates long before Jesus, and you can even go back to Confucius back in in China. Never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself. And Confucius lived 551 BCE. A version of the Golden Rule appears in Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, and the rest of the world's major religions. So nothing new there. Great wisdom. The Sermon on the Mount is supposedly sublime wisdom from Jesus. Well, it contains a lot of bad advice that Christians are wise not to follow, such as giving away all your possessions and not saving for the future. Matt Dillahunty did a nice deconstruction of the Sermon on the Mount, and it's in the Iron Chariots Wiki, and you can find that there if you want to go delve into details. So that's worth looking at.
Yeah, just go there and type Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, so that's easy to find. So what about real wisdom in the ancient world? Well, Solon, living 638 to 558 BCE, was a lawgiver, and his 10 Commandments, or the 10 Commandments that are attributed to him, are much wiser than the 10 Commandments in the Bible. You can go look those up. It talks about friendship and leadership and things that are of actual practical use. Epicurus, 341 to 270 BCE, was a philosopher and came up with the idea of atoms in the void, and he formulated the problem of evil, among many other things. A brilliant man. Had hit a lot of things right on the head. Seneca the Younger, 4 BCE to 65 CE. He was a philosopher, Stoic, and much of the love and morals sentiment in the New Testament seems to have come from him. And later Christian forgeries try to co-opt him as part of the Christian elders, although he had no relation to that. Okay, so what about miracles? Well, stories of ancient miracles are a dime a dozen. And you can look up Apollonius of Tyana. It would be a good example of an ancient miracle worker. What real evidence do we have today of ancient miracles? Not much. We have claimed holy relics, which can be, fabricated and used to rob the gullible. We have old stories, such as that of an empty tomb that can't be verified. And we have stories about people who believe the miracles, such as Doubting Thomas, and none of these are convincing.
Right. I always like the story about Doubting Thomas, because I say, where's the evidence? And they go, well, Doubting Thomas got evidence. It's like, well, that doesn't do any of us good now that it's another story in your book that he got evidence.
Right. It seems like it's just kind of trying to buttress a bad story, right?
Right.
So what's more likely, that the laws of the universe were broken for the sake of a parlor trick or a miracle used to market God, or somebody was mistaken and received? Which of those is more likely? David Hume is a modern thinker who did quite a bit of work on miracles and has a very good deconstruction.
By modern, you mean
modernish
17th century or so?
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's good stuff.
More
then.
modern.
Good stuff then, yeah. What about ascension to heaven? Well, the afterlife played an important role in ancient Egyptian religion, and its belief system is one of the earliest known in recorded history. I won't go into it, but the Egyptians had a notion, something like we would call a soul, Ka, a life force that leaves the body after death, and your Ba is your personality, and these have to be reunited in the next life, and there's, it's not exactly the same, but there still is this idea of ascending to heaven, and the pharaohs certainly did, and that's what a lot of the rituals concerning mummification had to do with, is making sure that the kings would be properly provisioned in the next life. Greek had a notion of afterlife, and that was Hades, although Hades is certainly less pleasant than heaven. It's kind of a dark, awful place. The Norse had their notion of Valhalla, which is the afterlife for war heroes. So this is nothing new here, nothing new in the ascension to heaven. What about resurrection? Well, resurrection was a common part of various mythologies used to explain the seasons, and I think we could say that Joseph Campbell recognized this as one of the archetypes, right? The resurrecting God. There are tons of these. There's the Ugaritic Baal, there's Melqart, Adonis, Eshmun, Osiris, Attis, Dumuzi. These are all gods of various cultures. Many of them, there's a kind of a whole category of life, rebirth, and death deities. There's so many of them, they get their own category. And all of these, by the way, are predate Jesus. And these gods are often gods of vegetation. They die and they are reborn every year, just as the vegetation dies and is reborn as the sun goes up and down based on our good old axial tilt. This is also, these gods tend to be where we get the tradition of eating of the body too, right? Because you're eating of the god, eating the god's body gives you strength or gives you that edge, right? Kind of the power bars of the ancient world. And a lot of these gods were symbolized by vegetation or grain or something like that. So as far as Jesus' resurrection, there's a problem there that a lot of folks don't quite realize. The earliest versions of Mark, which is the earliest gospel, the earliest copies that we have of it, ends at verses 16:8 with an empty tomb. And this is not the case that some of it's missing. These earlier copies ended there. And that means that the author didn't know about the resurrection 40 years later, or he didn't think it was important. So again, we have this problem of, where does this resurrection come from? If it wasn't important to the original author of the thing, it wasn't known to the original author of the thing, where did it come from? Well, it's probably a later edition. And we do have different endings. There have been different endings found of Mark that go off in different directions after that. And the canonized version that has been accepted definitely has a different author than the original, based on the analysis of the type of writing and things. So it seems very likely that the resurrection was an addition that was added on. And perhaps it was to gain converts from religions that had a resurrection tradition. So you wanted to get some of those guys, hey, we got resurrection too. You can come hang with us. So multiple resurrections, a second coming. I talked about the second coming in one of my earlier shows. Certainly if you have earlier gods that are resurrecting every year, that's more impressive than a god that resurrects just once, right? So that's more interesting. But Jesus' second coming is nothing more than a broken promise. It's something that he said would happen and has not happened, and he actually gave times that it would happen, and those times have passed. So it didn't happen. So you can make a quite strong statement that this is a broken promise, and nobody should find it impressive. So I talked about that in more detail on episode 478, the failure of the second coming.
748.
748, thank you. So in the ancient world, gods were a dime a dozen. There were jillions of them, more than you could point a stick at. And many of them were cynically created, right? Were created by humans, and people generally knew they were created by humans, right? So this is a bit different than there's a worship of something and it gets embellished over time. These are deliberate creations. The god Serapis was invented by Ptolemy and was promulgated by the state for multiple centuries before the creation of Jesus. And this is an example of a made-up god, and people generally knew this, although they were the more ignorant folks worship those gods. Seneca the Younger had a great quote, religion is regarded by the common people as true, by the wise as false, and by the rulers as useful. And that seems to be a very, it seems to get at the whole idea of inventing a god for the sake of the state. There's another one that I was tickled by, and Emperor Hadrian, Roman Emperor Hadrian had a favorite, and that's a term referred to somebody who's part of his court who's kind of special. And this guy happened to be a boy toy of his, male lover, Antinous. And he was elevated to a god by Hadrian after the boy died. He was a teenager.
Wow, that's a really nice favor.
It's a really nice favor. And
that's very thoughtful. If only all lovers would be that
yes,
considerate.
that considerate, yeah. and so there's a lot of statuary associated with this young man, and
Catholics do the same thing with saints now, more or less, right?
Sure. And I was especially tickled by the reaction of the early church Christian elders, Justin Martyr, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian of Carthage, all knew of Antinous and were rather kind of pissed off about it and rather pissy about it because they were trying to promote their God man who they and here was this boy toy being promoted anyway. So they were a little upset about it. Even the divinity of Jesus is a late invention, not settled until the Council of Nicaea in year 325 CE. So there were all sorts of different branches of Christianity before that time that didn't believe that Jesus was divine or had some different spin on it. And so there was this case of, okay, here we're going to have this council and we're going to settle this stuff and choose one religion. And I file this under the phrase I often say of the state religion is not your religion, right? So it was kind of forced down the throats of everybody else.
So, I mean, I know the Council of Nicaea sort of canonized a whole bunch of books.
Yes, but
didn't the book? I mean, the books were around. You know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Some of them mention the divinity of Jesus, right?
Right.
Were those books just like specifically ignored by people who didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus?
Well, there just wasn't a consensus.
Okay.
And so, it's like a making sausage sort of thing that you may not want to, you might like the outcome, but you might not like how it happened. So, there were different visions, different ideas, and no sort of concrete evidence. People can point to different things in the Bible, but as Jeff D. points out, it's a great big book of multiple choice, right? Anyway, so the conclusion here is what's more likely? That the mythology surrounding Jesus is true, but the creator of the universe lacked imagination and was just a slave to early mythologies? Or that Jesus was an amalgam of marketing ideas from earlier religions that were popular at the time of his creation? And I think the latter is true. Though I'm not claiming a conspiracy, I'm not claiming that this is something that was intentional or whatever. I do think that there was a desire to grow the religion of Christianity at the time, and they had a different attitude about the use of truth at that time. And I think they were happy to embellish and invent things in order to get more converts because they thought the ends justified the means. I don't think that today we would tolerate such a thing, or we try not to tolerate such a thing.
Scientology,
right. So once you see the earlier beliefs in context, Jesus is just not interesting. He's not that interesting, and therefore there's nothing new under the sun, and that's a failure of Christianity.